Dublin is a city of music and stone. The streets hum each day with the sound of traffic and footsteps. Bells follow everywhere, ringing down avenues. You can feel the weight of all the years on every wall and with each breath. Dublin is a city built on the bones of 100 older cities. It's lovely and alive, and even though I lived there my entire life, I never actually saw Dublin until I was almost 30. I was born blind. Last month, I was given new eyes. Never have I regretted a thing more. There might be some momentary discomfort. The doctor's voice was gentle, young enough to make me a bit nervous. Something about old doctors and fat chefs speaks of experience, but that's unkind of me. Unfair. I tried to remain cheerful as the doctor removed the bandages. The gauze was warm. Don't panic if it takes some time, even days, the doctor told me, for the first images to... I screamed. I saw light. I saw. At least, I think I did. No real frame of reference prior, you understand. But it was some new, alien, overwhelming sensation. My eyes, new and artificial, blinked. Blurry shapes, barely shadows, began to focus. Are you okay? A familiar voice asked. Aye, Sinead, I'm grand. Don't touch your face, the doctor warned. I lowered my hand. Wouldn't dream of it. The figures were growing clearer by the moment. There were 3 in the room standing around my bed. It was shocking how quickly my brain was learning to process an entirely new sense. Images coming together like a few drops suddenly flowing into a storm. One of the figures on my right leaned over. She was a girl, I was quite sure based on descriptions I'd heard and previous research. Hello, she said with Sinead's voice. Sin, friend, fancy seeing you here. Your hair. My hair? It's... What is it? She wrinkled her eyes. Red? That's red, huh? It's lovely. It suits you well. I glanced over to the other 2 people in the room. The one directly in front of the foot of the bed was watching me, jotting something into a book. Doc? The young man smiled. How are you feeling, Noah? The finest. No troubles at all, and I... Final person in the room didn't look much like the other 2. Nearly twice as tall as the others, back bent to avoid hitting the ceiling. The creature watched me with small eyes like bullet holes. It had a pair of mouths, one over the other. The voice that emerged from the mouths surprised me. You look well. Are you thirsty? The monster asked in a lilting tone, soft and feminine, not much beyond a girl. You all right, Noah? Sinead asked. You've gone as pale as the dead. I looked at my friend. Does everything seem okay here? What do you mean? I don't know, I said, watching the tall thing with the voice of a girl. I turned to the doctor. Is it possible I might experience hallucinations with these new eyes? Aye, it's possible. Your brain is still getting adjusted to processing visual feedback for the first time in your life. It's not just the eyes, but the nerves that are fresh. Give everything time. If you see anything unusual, well, everything's unusual for you, right? The doctor laughed. A large spider with butterfly wings flew out of his mouth. Lovely, I said, laying down. I think I need some rest. Rest up, the thing with 2 mouths told me. I'll be close. All you'll need to do is call for me. I was out of the hospital the next day. Doc made me promise to keep a journal of any odd sights I encountered. Having never seen anything at all before, it was a bit odd. Mostly lovely, with a few exceptions. Sinead was a darling and took time off from uni to play tour guide. We visited Trinity College and St. Stephen's Green, the James Joyce Center, Kilmainham Jail, and I swear every museum in town. I'd been to all of those places before, but I was literally seeing them now with new eyes. Sin led me from spot to spot with the enthusiasm of a local, showing off her neighborhood to a visiting Martian. It was a lovely week where my mind made connections between old sounds and new sights at a breakneck pace. Colors became more than names. They became alive, vivid, and each unique as a fingerprint. However, not everything I saw left a pleasant impression. A few times, each day during the first week, I would notice that I was being watched. The feeling always came from behind me, like a hot needle hovering just above the skin on my neck. I'd turn around to find a dozen eyes staring. Eyes, some as large as manhole covers, others the size of swimming pools, were peeking out at me from the walls of nearby buildings. They were entirely black, except for the small, white irises. When the eyes noticed me staring back, they would blink and disappear. The more time that passed, the more uncomfortable visions I'd see. Children with blurred faces walking down the street in pairs. A man with a cigarette always hidden in the smoke. Shadows drifted across clouds. Dark silhouettes that spoke of secret giants just out of sight. I kept reminding myself that these creatures weren't real, but my blood always ran a little quicker when I encountered one. On the 4th day of my tour of Dublin, I decided to touch one of the monsters. A small sprite, not much more than a red glow the size of a coin, was buzzing down the street. It came close, orbiting my head. I never looked at it, never let on. While Sinead's eye was drawn by a bookstore, I struck, reaching out and catching the sprite in one hand. For a moment I felt nothing at all. Then, it was like someone dragged a razor blade across my palm. "Shite!" I yelled, shaking my hand open, and the red glow zipped away. "What's the matter then, Noah? Are you all right?" Sinead asked. "Couldn't be finer," I replied, tucking my hand in my pocket. "Just a cramp." I could feel a warm liquid between my fingers. Sinead was waving her arms, explaining the history of the bookstore next to us. I tried to listen, but kept getting distracted. The monsters were real enough to draw blood. I shivered and told myself it was only the breeze. On our 5th day walking around Dublin, I saw the butcher shop. Sin and I had just gotten lunch, sitting outside the cafe in the spring sunshine, listening to the birds and the bells. I couldn't get over the way the light reflected from my beer bottle onto the table. I kept passing my hand over it, watching the reflection ripple across my palm. There was a bandage taped there. The tiny creature's bite had gone deep. I was looking around at all of the people in motion when I caught sight of an out-of-place shop across the street. The first thing that stood out was the pigs. 6 large hogs dangled from chains in front of the store. They were hacked up with gaping wounds gone black at the edges. All 6 carcasses were covered in fat flies. The bodies buzzed loud enough to be heard over the traffic, and when the wind shifted, I caught a whiff of the rot and almost returned my lunch to the table. "Flounder not sitting well?" Sinead asked, rocking back in her chair, eyes almost certainly closed behind huge sunglasses. "Do you not smell that? I can't believe they're allowed to just leave the pigs out there. Must be some kind of health code violation." "What pigs?" "Across the street in front of the butcher." Sinead turned her head, looked, and frowned. "The closest thing to a butcher shop there is the organic olive oil and vinegar shop. I believe you might be seeing phantoms again." "Sure, but smelling them too?" Sin shrugged. "Mind is a funny thing. Senses are like dominoes, each influencing the others." I rubbed some lemon juice under my nose to combat the odor. The pigs were swinging gently from their hooks. There was a faded wooden sign above the shop. It read, "Carver's Market." So nice to meet you. The building was dirty and sat small between its neighbors. There were blotches everywhere, mostly red, black, and old. Grime caked the windows, one of which was missing a few panes of glass. As I studied the shop, a figure emerged from the door, stooping to get through. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, the thing had a human body but the head of a boar. A white horn jutted out from above one ear, while another horn curled back and over the opposite ear. "Hey, Sinead?" "Yes?" "What's the animal with the spiral horns?" "Rams, why do you ask?" I sipped my tea. I saw a little tremor in the cup. Just, popped into my head, I guess. The creature was completely naked except for a stained apron which was stretched by an enormous gut. Its arms were thick with coils of muscle, and there was not a patch of visible hair on the giant. Sinead was chatting about where we might go for dinner later, but I couldn't pry my attention from the butcher. It stood next to the carcasses, looming over the busy street just a few feet from the shop. A flow of people passed by without sparing the butcher or his shop a glance. The creature crossed its arms and tilted its head. Faster than I could follow, it shot out a hand the size of a football and snatched a man off the footpath. Except that wasn't exactly right. A version of the man kept walking, while an identical copy kicked and struggled against the butcher's grip. Some twin, some clone. The monster carried its shrieking captive over to the line of pigs, pulled another chain down from the rack, and pressed the hook on the end into the man's back until he was hanging. The screaming got much worse. I couldn't even hear Sinead anymore. My new eyes were locked on the scene across the street. The butcher calmly walked inside the shop and then returned with a long knife that curved upwards. It held the squirming man by the hair and placed the point of the blade on his shirt just under his belly button. "Don't," I whispered. "No, no, no, no." "Don't what?" Sinead asked. I didn't answer. The butcher lightly ran the knife up the shirt. The fabric split, revealing a pale belly. Slowly, the creature returned the blade to the man's belly button, pressed, pulled up, hard. I've never heard another person make a sound like that poor fellow did as he hung on that chain, pawing at his stomach, trying to keep his guts in. Oily purple and gray ropes kept slipping out from the slit in the man, squeezing between his desperate fingers. He was opened from neck to navel. The only mercy was that it didn't last long, and then he was empty and still. That identical copy of the gutted guy looked healthy and oblivious. He was 3 steps from rounding the corner. After 2, the man stopped, looked around like he was confused, and then grabbed his stomach. The shriek that ripped out of his mouth was the exact same that came from his twin. A crowd gathered around the thrashing man. Phones came out, some to call for help, others to record. The stranger's shoes kept scraping against the footpath. Fast, slower, then no movement. "Saints above," Sinead whispered. "What should we do?" I wanted to answer. Please do believe me, but I couldn't find my voice. The butcher was watching me, tiny black eyes pinning me to my chair. It licked the curved knife. I stood up. "Can we go? I'll leave cash on the table for the bill." Sin looked from the growing crowd and the dead man back to me. "Shouldn't we help?" she asked. "Do you think we can, or is this past us?" Sinead bit her lip but stood up. I tucked money under my mug. I tried not to notice the butcher's eyes following me as we left. I'd never seen spring before. It's a hell of a lovely thing. Trees shedding dead skin to reveal all that green. Nearly 30 years in Dublin, hearing and smelling and tasting nearly 30 springs. But this was the first I'd been able to watch. Such a shame I spent so much of those weeks with my eyes closed, praying that the monsters slouching through the city wouldn't notice me. After encountering the butcher on Cowes Lane, I begged off the remainder of Sinead's planned tour of the city. The cut on my palm and the dead man were enough proof that I couldn't keep pretending the creatures I saw were hallucinations. The smoking man was following me, face always hidden in the exhaust. It stuck to him like a veil. Compared to some of the horrors I saw that spring, though, he was damn near Bonnie. There was an ever-growing parade of nightmares roaming the streets wherever I looked. Men and women who, when the light struck them just right, would turn translucent, filled with black veins that twisted into knots. Other abominations buzzed and slithered and knelt on the streets, shaking. Some noticed me staring. Every now and then one might slowly, quietly change their course, to start heading in my direction. When that happened, I ran, dignity be damned. So far, none of the creatures chose to pursue. After one such encounter with a cloud made of teeth and silk, I ducked down an alley to catch my breath. More than once I'd considered locking myself in my house, but I'd run into monsters there as well. Eyes looking through windows, fingers pressing against wallpaper, and my name whispered whenever I passed a closed door. I wasn't about to wait for trouble to come find me, alone and asleep. So I spent my nights walking. I figured if something was going to take a bite out of me, I might as well die with a pretty view. And Dublin's skyline at sunset was worth dying over at least a few dozen times. Imagine the finest gold and violet dusk you've ever seen, where the light comes in layers and each unique shade only survives for a moment before dissolving forever. Now imagine you've lived your entire life in the dark. Can you blame me for walking, even with monsters about? The truth is, while I spent those weeks scared out of my sacred wits, nothing harmed me. Followed, sure. One wounded me once, but that was self-defense. Might be if I treated these abominations with the same cool distance you afford wasps. Maybe I'd eventually adjust. Breath successfully caught and restrained after fleeing from the tooth cloud, I exited the alley from the same way I'd entered. But the street I emerged onto was unfamiliar. The buildings were older, the road, cobblestone. Not a car in sight. Bollocks, I said. I turned back to the alley only to find the opening gone. A blank brick wall stood in its place. Not great, I muttered. This new street was crowded. Men and women and children walked by wearing clothes at least 100 years out of date. Big hats and layered dresses. Even the kids wore ties. Nobody seemed to notice that I stood out like a jalapeno in a bowl of milk. I tried to blend in as best I could, looking around for any familiar landmarks. My eyes happened upon the face of a child sitting on a stoop across the street. I swallowed a scream. The creature wasn't human. Almost definitely not human. Its eyes were huge compared to its small face. The irises were white and all of the surrounding orb black. There was no hair visible on its head, no eyebrows, and the skin looked slightly damp. The child's nose was barely a slit, and its mouth set too far low, all but eradicating the concept of a chin. Fat, square teeth were just visible between thin lips. The combined effect made the creature look both ancient and newborn at the same time. I looked at other figures in the crowd, trying to act natural. I would have whistled if I wasn't so worried I'd only throw up. All of the faces resembled the child. Lineless, hairless, pale with striking features. I ducked my head down and began walking. The people weren't the only oddities on the street. The shops had the strangest titles, all painted in crude wooden signs that swung in the breeze above doorways. I read them as I hurried along the footpath. Tooth and Consequences, Fine Dentistry and Palm Readings. Gnaw and Gnash Daycare. Axes and X's. Artisanal Hardware and Marriage Counseling. You Dirty, Worthless Worm Ice Cream Parlor. I rushed past them all, doing my best to stare down at the cobblestones. Every now and then, I'd catch a flash of what was happening behind some of the shop windows. This made me walk faster. I approached the corner and stopped. A green sign stood on a tall pole. Hollow Bridge Road. So where's the bridge? I wondered. There were two shops on opposite ends of the lane. One appeared to be a baker. The other... I'm not sure how to describe it. The shop didn't have a traditional sign, instead a massive cross that looked like it was carved from driftwood hung above the doorway. A chubby man thing wearing a vest and short sleeves sat on a stool outside the shop between two tables. One of the tables held a cage full of panicked birds. The other table supported a box of wooden crosses. Humming softly, the man reached into the cage and snatched a bird from the air in mid-flight. Except I was close enough now to see that it wasn't a bird. It was a tiny, winged woman. Miniature blue feathers sprouted from her back. She was screaming in a small, fragile voice. I moved closer. I don't know why. Casually, like he was plucking petals from a flower, the man ripped the wings from the creature's back. Her shrieking became frantic, so high-pitched that it wove in and out of the audible range. In one clean motion, the man pressed his captive against a wooden cross from the box and held her in place with one hand. With his other hand, he retrieved a hammer and nail from the table. "No," I said, my voice lost in the crowd. I took a step towards the man. "Don't do..." He was so fast, I never saw the movement, only the result. The woman shivered and twitched on her little cross, a hobnail through her chest. She kicked twice and then was still. I wanted to hurt the man. I wanted to walk over to the squat little bastard and drive a few nails into the soft, sensitive parts of his body. But when he glanced up from his work and I saw his black and white eyes, all of the anger left me in an instant. I turned, pretending to study some other shop, praying that the creature would not notice me. While I was hiding, a giant with the head of a hog walked out of a shop across the street. The butcher. A woman followed the creature outside. She had a blank, warped face like all of the rest. Unlike most, though, she did have hair. It was black and beautiful and dragged on the ground behind her, leaving a wet trail. The butcher leaned down, almost kneeling. The woman gave it a kiss on the cheek, then wiped her hands on a white apron, just like the one the giant wore. Both aprons were covered in red stains. The butcher stood and began walking down the street. I did my best to fade into the nearest brick wall. When the monster passed, I was overwhelmed with the smell of meat and vanilla. It didn't notice me, or didn't care if it did. The woman with the dark hair returned to her shop. A simple blue and silver sign announced her profession. Flowers Bakery. I'm not sure why I went in to look. The street was full of horrors. There was no reason for me to drink in another with my new eyes. But I couldn't resist. I approached the dirty window, cupped my hands against the glass, and peered in. Bodies swung from chains, impaled by meat hooks, leaking purple red onto the wooden floorboards. The butcher's work. I watched the woman scoop up a handful of the offal that was puddling under the hooks. She carried the material over to her counter and plopped it into a circle of fresh dough. Grinning, the baker licked her fingers clean. I threw up on the street. A few of the creatures noticed, watching me like I was an animal that had wandered into a dinner party. A mixture of amused and annoyed. I heard a ringing sound coming from an alley to my left. A phone. I patted my pockets until I located my cell. It wasn't the source of the ringing, and when I tried to call Sinead, there was no signal. The other phone continued to ring. Not having all that many options and wary of getting any more attention from the locals, I slipped down the alley. Sitting in the middle of the space was a tall white and green box with a cross-hatched glass door. Telephone. I opened the door and picked up the receiver. "Hello, Noah, where's the crack?" asked a familiar voice on the other end of the line. "Sinead?" "I see you're playing tourist in a bad part of town." Her voice was wrong, strained and overlapping, like 3 or 4 people speaking at once. "You're not Sinead." "Yeah, I suppose not. Not yet. We just wanted you to feel comfortable during our chat." "I'm about as comfortable as a cat in a shark tank, thank you kindly." The voices laughed. "You know what they say about curiosity in the cat, Noah?" Why did you need to go looking for trouble? Hell to that. I didn't go searching for a thing. The voices giggled. And yet trouble you found. So run, little cat. Run before the sharks find out you don't belong in the water. I opened my mouth to reply back with something cutting. Then I looked out of the glass door to see creatures watching me from the mouth of the alley. It was getting darker much quicker than it should. A sunset bled out over the antique street, spilling orange gold light over the cobblestones. Do you know what it feels like to be disemboweled? Not Sinead asked. If it's done quickly with a sharp knife, you won't experience much pain at first. Just a strange, sucking feeling, then a terrible emptiness as your insides flow out of you into a slick pile at your feet. Your first instinct will be to catch them, and to push them back into your gut. This won't work. The ropes and the organs will slip through your fingers. Then, that's when the pain starts. Of course, if the gutting is done with a dull knife. Slowly. Why aren't you running yet, Noah? I burst out of the telephone booth in a dead sprint, arms held up to ward off any of the locals that might try to grab me. None of them did. Instead, I saw them pause and point towards me as I came out onto the street. It was already full night and lamps were glowing, casting cool shadows on the cobblestones. I ran back towards the first alley, hoping that it would be there. The creatures continued to watch me. I saw mouths pulled back, eyes wide, chests shaking. They were laughing at me, silently, the entire street. I stepped into a long shadow from a nearby lamp and tripped. I'd stepped into the shadow, my legs sinking to the knee. It was like finding a soft spot in a marsh. The shadow was cold and wet, sticking to my pants as I tried to scramble out. The locals weren't laughing anymore. I pulled hard enough I worried my hip would dislocate, but the shadow held. It was like tar, ink, quicksand. Something bumped my ankle from under the surface. I screamed, tried once more to stand, and only ended up slipping further into the shadow. Now both legs were stuck, and I was falling. I clawed at the ground, but felt myself dragged under. It was so cold. I held my breath for as long as I could, floating in the dark. Just before I passed out, I inhaled. When I woke up, I was lying on a footpath, looking up at a bright summer sky. The sounds of Dublin hummed around me. Modern Dublin. My Dublin. I sat up and looked around. I was back on Grafton Street. People milled about, normal people. My stomach felt like I'd swallowed a wasp's nest. It still does. It's been a week since my visit to Hollow Bridge. Sinead's been calling. The real Sinead. At least, I think the real one. I've been avoiding her and everyone else. I keep thinking of the butcher. Of all the creatures laughing, following. They all seem so hungry in my memory. I can't walk down the street without watching every shadow. Terrified one wrong step could send me back to Hollow Bridge. Most nights I barricade myself in my bedroom doing research. I found a group online that has experienced similar encounters. And we all have something in common. We've all been given new eyes. Even when I'm hiding, I can feel an invisible pressure bearing down on me. Part of me wants to run, but a bigger part is tired of running. If the next shadow I step through sends me back to Hollow Bridge, I'll go through chin up and eyes sharp. I'll find where that fucking bridge goes. My online group is starting to feel like a small family. We all have our little nicknames to protect our identities. I didn't want to reveal that my name is Noah, so I used the first call sign that came to mind. Dublin. I realize now that choosing a nickname based on the city where I live is actually less secretive than simply giving my real name. Oh well. If anyone asks, I'll tell them I'm from Cork. Thanks everyone for watching tonight's video, listening to tonight's story. The story today was written by Travis Brown. You can also find their work on Reddit under their profile Grand Theft Motto. And check out their works on Amazon. There's House with 100 Doors, as well as How to Build a Haunted House. Unforgettable Tales by Travis Brown. You can find his work on his website as well, Travis Brown Writing. And please support the author and let him know Jordan Grupe Horror sent you. Today's video was supported by patrons like Mark from Earth, Crimson Muse, Joy Burton, Diane Showers, Mark Sewall, Cheryl James, Pick Your Sticker, Teddy Dog, Clue 404, Mamakato, Dante Kincaid, Zarin Ray, Angela Donovan, Blarian 50, Devin Kyle, Timothy Baird, Ajeti, Bert Turner, Bajani Espinal, Michael Pierce, Big Joe, Carrie Harkonnen, LaDonna Spivey, Scott Tanaka. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Grupe Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in the next Hollow's End story. Links to join are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. See you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.